Well, Glenn Gould is back in the studio to introduce Act Two of The Bourgeois Hero, his conversation piece about Richard Strauss. Nice to have you back again, Glenn. Now, as I recall, Act One came to a crashing climax with the Dance of the Seven Veils and with some rather revealing comments about Strauss' personal life. And I gather in Act Two we pick up the story from there.
Yeah, that's right, Howard. Though there's really a bit of a gap chronologically between the point where we left off and the opening of Act Two. We really pick up the story just before the First World War. I managed to neatly sidestep thereby Der Rosenkavalier, which is rather conspicuous by its absence in the soundtrack, I guess, though several of the characters, in fact, talk about it at quite some length. And that's simply because I happen not to be particularly fond of Rosenkavalier.
Really?
Yeah, I find the subject too worldly, I guess, and the music too saccharine for my taste, but that's the stuff of another conversation, I guess. I just decided to indulge myself, especially in Act Two, by choosing only pieces that are at or near the top of my personal Strauss hit parade.
Well, now, Act Two has 4 scenes, I gather.
That's right, 4 subject areas, so to speak. The first, which is really the 4th scene of the program overall, is nominally about Strauss' relationship with his contemporaries, Mahler, Schoenberg, and so on. Then the next scene, Scene 5, is about his relationship with his librettist, Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Scene 6 is about what happened to him during the Nazi regime, some very controversial times for him, as you know. And the final scene, Scene 7, is a sort of meditation on his last years and, in a way, on the meaning of his life, I suppose.
Which is?
Well, for me, the most remarkable thing about Strauss, Howard, is the way in which, in the end, he learned to live without reference to what was happening in the world around him and to work without reference particularly to what was going on in the musical world around him. As Wolfgang Sawallisch says at one point in the program, to walk against the zeitgeist. And I think there's a great lesson in that, you know.
But don't many people criticize Strauss for precisely that reason, for being so out of touch, if you like?
Indeed they do. And I tried to represent that view, which, as you say, is very prevalent, and as fairly as I could in the program. John Culshaw, for example, takes essentially that position, and if I may say so, a very conventional position with regard to Strauss. In effect, that Strauss wrote himself out someplace around the time of Rosenkavalier and spent the last 40 years of his life simply repeating empty gestures, somewhat reminiscent of the early works. And
you don't agree, obviously.
No, I certainly don't. Although, as with all sweeping charges, there's some truth to it, I suppose. Strauss had some bad moments, let's face it, in the years between the 2 wars. There's no doubt about that at all, I think. He and Hofmannsthal got involved in some, absolutely ludicrous operatic projects. Ägyptische Helena, for example. Matter of fact, I'd be hard-pressed to make much of a case for Fraune Schatten, come to that. I think the libretto is absolutely absurd. Music is often quite beautiful, but it's still a silly libretto. But even at that time, around 1918 and so on, he was able to write the most interesting songs of his life, for instance. Pieces like the Ophelia Lieder, which are really very rarely done, even today, and which are, I think, much, much more interesting than all those sickly sweet tunes of the early years like Cecily or Morgan or whatever. The Alpine Symphony is another example. It's always had a very bad press, and it's a very uneven piece, I suppose, but it's also a fascinating piece, really, much, much more interesting, I think, than something like Zarathustra, for instance.
Of course, it's rather odd that, thanks to the film 2001, Strauss' reputation with the widest public rests primarily on Zarathustra.
That's exactly true, sadly. It's probably the weakest of the tone poems, Zarathustra, I think, and I don't think Stanley Kubrick did anybody but himself much of a service by resurrecting it from a relative obscurity yet richly deserved. But anyway, what I started out to say back there was that there were bad periods, certainly, between the wars, but I think they were difficult times for Strauss, precisely because he hadn't yet managed to resolve the zeitgeist conflict, He hadn't yet decided whether he could exist without reference to the styles and fads and movements which he lived through. But when he decided that he could, or when he was perhaps simply too old to care what anybody thought, then you get to something really extraordinary, I think. You get those pieces like Capriccio or Metamorphosen or even the Oboe Concerto, which simply transcend time and place and idiom and the notion of, if you like, progress, with quotation marks around it in art. I must say that Metamorphosen is one of the, half dozen pieces maybe in all of music, and don't ask me to name the other 5 just at this moment, but one of the half dozen pieces that I think about at least for a few minutes almost every day, and that's been going on for years now. I don't listen to it all that often necessarily. I just sort of run it or some small part of it through my head. And for me, it's a sort of homing device. It's a kind of radar signal that I tune in on, I know that sounds very fanciful, a little crazy, but it's true nonetheless. And when I feel I'm in danger of losing contact with what music is all about, in danger of forgetting that it can flourish without any reference to the collegial collective, that it can come into being without any input from the artistic climate which prevailed when it was conceived, then I sort of just tune in on that, on Metamorphosen, and it just puts me straight right away. I really think that Metamorphosen, which, as you know, Howard, we used during the closing scene of The Bourgeois Hero, is just about the most moving music ever written.
Well, I think on that note we should get on with the second act of The Bourgeois Hero.
Right.
Will you do the honors and list the participants once again?
I'd be delighted. In this act, and in order of appearance, as they say, we hear from the philosopher Geoffrey Pesant, the composer Wolfgang Sawallisch, the author and record producer John Culshaw, the author and conductor Norman Del Mar, the critic Henry Levenger, the composer Wolfgang Fortner, the composer Stanley Silverman, and the author Jonathan Cott.